first thing I want to say is what a huge pleasure it is to see this painting in the flesh. I've known it for 20 years and I've often seen it reproduced, but no reproduction can convey the quality of a painting, and I find this particularly the case with McCahon. You would think his work would reproduce easily, but in fact so much gets left behind, even in the kind of high quality photographs that you have in this catalogue. You know, I came and had a look at the work yesterday, and I had sort of had a memory that it was really, you know, black, white and grey, but there's so much more subtle colouring in it than, like, little touches of blue in the water here and here, and this unusual plummy coloured colour which is so different from the greys and the blacks. And of course the rough texture of the dew canvas. This is a work you really do need to see in the flesh to appreciate it fully. However, I'll come back to say something about the specifics of the painting, but in the meantime I want to talk about, I suppose, the backstory of this painting, and it has a very rich backstory. I first became aware of it back in 1996 when I think it was the very first McCahon project that I was ever involved in, was putting together an exhibition in what used to be known as the McCahon Room, which I called Candles in a Dark Room, James K. Baxter and Colin McCahon. And it was an exhibition exploring the relationship between the poet and the painter. And one of the works that I was able to borrow for the exhibition was, in fact, this very work. So it became the sort of centerpiece of that particular exhibition. And it's that aspect of the painting I'm going to talk about now, its relationship to James K. Baxter. There's nothing on the painting itself which indicates that connection. It's something you sort of have to find out about, and quite often that is the case with McCahon's paintings. They do have quite an elaborate context that helps you understand and appreciate them, at least I find it so. Both Baxter and McCahon were Dunedin boys. Colin grew up in Maui Hill in Dunedin. Baxter grew up in Brighton, in the town south of the city. Colin was a little bit older. He was born in 1919. James Baxter was born in 1926, so there was a 7-year age difference. But it's always struck me how extraordinary it was that out of that same quite small city, two major religious artists, and I'm talking about major in world terms, should emerge in exactly the same time and place. Why was that? Is it just pure coincidence, or is there something else? I'm not going to go into that today, but there are so many parallels between Baxter and McCahon as artists. Their attachment to the landscape of Otago, the way they got started as artists by either writing about or painting the New Zealand landscape, particularly the Otago landscape. Colin's first major works were paintings of Otago Peninsula, and James K. Baxter's early poetry about the Brighton coastline and so forth. So that was one major thing they had in common. A second was their deep attachment to religion all through their lives. That's another subject that I'll come back to as well. A further point of connection as their lives developed was their strong interest in and attachment to things Maori. Partly this came about through the circumstances of their personal lives. James Baxter married Jacqueline Sturm, a Maori woman. Colin McCahon, his first daughter Victoria, married a Maori chap from Tainui Waikato tribe, and so Colin had Maori grandchildren. And I think that in both cases, that sort of familial connection with Maori influenced their thinking about race relations in New Zealand, and they both became deeply absorbed in Maori history, Maori mythology, Maori imagery of various kinds. And I could continue with these parallels between the two. Both of them had a very close acquaintance with alcohol, for example. Anyway, they met for the first time, I believe, in 1946. In those years, Colin was living in the Nelson area and would occasionally return to Dunedin. And he went back to Dunedin in 1946 to do a big painting of Otago Peninsula, which he was commissioned to paint. And while he was back in Dunedin, he met James K. Baxter. I'm pretty sure of this because soon after that they began to correspond with each other. And Colin went back to Nelson, and one of the first paintings that he painted in Tahunanui, the beach suburb outside of Nelson, in 1947, was this little painting. It's not much bigger than this sheet, called A Candle in a Dark Room. And he said of this painting that it was inspired by James K. Baxter. It is, in effect, a kind of symbolic portrait of James K. Baxter. And I think Colin was obviously hugely impressed by the prodigious talent of this young man. His first book was published when he was 18 years old, and he saw him as a candle in a dark room. Whether you read the dark room as New Zealand or the war-torn world or human life in general, I guess that's up to you, but he saw him as a sort of shining light, if you like, in that context. In 1948, McCahon moved from Nelson to Christchurch, and Baxter moved from Dunedin to Christchurch. So through the year 1948, they both lived in Christchurch, and I have a chapter about that in the book that Hamish mentioned, Bloomsbury South, because they were part of that very lively artistic cultural scene in Christchurch around that period. So that they became very close friends during that year, and they used to drink in pubs together. There are stories of Colin unrolling the canvas of the Virgin Compared in the United Services pub in Cathedral Square in Christchurch, and Baxter pulling out his little black book and reading the latest poems to Colin and their other friends. That very year, Baxter published one of his best books of poetry called Blow Wind of Fruitfulness, 1948, a book which Colin would certainly have read. So they became very good friends. And then, but that only lasted for a year because at the end of 1948, Baxter left Christchurch and got married to Jackie and moved to Wellington. And so they were never quite so close after that. But when the Baxters had their first child, Hilary, I think in 1949, they asked Colin and Anne McCahon to become her godparents. And so that was another attachment between the families. And to mark this occasion or this relationship, Colin gave the Baxters a painting, the one called There Is Only One Direction, a Jesus and Mary painting, which James K. Baxter had sitting on the wall above his writing desk for decades, apparently. And Baxter wrote a poem to Colin McCahon describing this, or responding to the painting. So that gives an indication of the closeness, the personal closeness that the two had. However, the McCahons, of course, eventually moved to Auckland in 1953, and Baxter continued to live in Wellington. And I don't know of much contact that happened between them over the years, but moving forward a decade or so, by the late 1960s and the 1970s, they were reacquainted with each other, because by this time, James Baxter had thrown off the bourgeois trappings of marriage and home and family and become the familiar figure with the long straggly hair and the bare feet and walking up and down the country like a kind of hobo St. Francis. And he had a social mission. He interested himself in the plight of people coming out of jail and drug addicts, and he ran various drop-in centres in Grafton Gully and so forth, and was quite a familiar figure around the streets of Auckland, I believe, in that period. Most of the time he spent living in isolation up the Wanganui River at a place called Jerusalem, or Hiruharama, which eventually became the sort of centre of a kind of a commune that he was the guru of, I guess you could say. Anyway, during those years, Baxter used to go around the traps in Auckland, hitting up his middle-class friends for money to help the causes that he was espousing. And apparently, this is a story that was told to me by Colin's son, William. Apparently, he turned up at the Colin's house one day and he said, "Oh, Colin, the old mate, you know, I've got a friend who's just coming out of the clink and he hasn't got a brass razoo, you know, have you got some spare change that you could give me for him?" And as I was told the story, McCahon emptied out his pockets and gave whatever money he had in his pockets to Baxter. And Baxter said to him something like, "Come on, you miserable bastard, you can do better than that. You're a bloody bourgeois academic, aren't you?" You know, very unpleasant. And William and Colin threw him out of the house. And Baxter started spouting poems at the art school, attacking McCahon. There was a real falling out between them. And this was around about 1970. And then within a year or two of that, Baxter dropped dead in the street in Auckland at the age of 46. And they were still unreconciled at that point. And it had a very profound effect on McCahon that Baxter had died and they were still estranged and had not come to, you know, they had not reconciled. And it preyed on his mind a bit. Anyway, soon after Baxter died, he made a little painting which he gave to Jackie Baxter. And it's this little painting. It's tiny. It's not much bigger than the sheet that it's printed on here. And it's got the title written up the side, vertically up the side, and the title is "Jim Passes the Northern Beaches." Jim Passes the Northern Beaches. There's rather an amusing story about this. A book about Baxter was published, which includes this painting, but it was printed like that, which has the title across the bottom, and whoever put the book together decided that was the way the painting went. Of course, if you look at it this way up, it becomes a seascape with a headland and a part of a cross, and with maybe a few birds in the sky. Quite what it is, if you look at it this way, I don't know. But anyway, I was at a conference in Dunedin and was talking about, I think, about Baxter and McCahon, and I pointed out that this painting was reproduced sideways in this book about Baxter. Anyway, Bill Oliver, who wrote the book, W.H. Oliver, was present on that occasion, and he said, it's printed like that because that's the way it's hung on the Baxter's wall. And Jackie had been given the painting by Colin, which she used to work in the Wellington Library, and she said, well, how shall I hang it? And he said, just hammer it into the wall with nails. And so she did. And assuming that this was the bottom of the painting because that's where the title was, she hung it up in this way. Poor Jackie was dreadfully embarrassed when Bill Oliver told her that she'd been hanging the painting in the wrong way for 20 years. Very important to McCahon, and it became a kind of seed from which many things grew. It's hardly an exaggeration to say that the whole year after Baxter died in October '72, that Colin was obsessed by his memory, and most of the work that he made in that year had something to do with Baxter, one way or another. And for example, he designed productions of 4 Baxter plays which were put on at Victoria University. This is an image that he did for the cover of that Baxter festival. It was called 4 Plays in early 1973. Colin designed all the sets, and he was a very keen theatre man and often got involved in theatre projects of various sorts. And very soon after that Wellington venture, I guess it was Easter 1973, I think round about now, and he did a whole host of drawings, must have been about 50 of them, mostly in charcoal, out at Muriwai, where he had his studio. And the common theme of these drawings was, as he called them, jet out from Muriwai. And most of them consist of a jet plane flying out from Mangere towards Australia, probably. But this is the sort of form that the drawings took. This one's called Jet Out from Ahipara, and same as the painting here. So you can see the flying cross, which doubles as an aeroplane. And here's one that's called Jet Out from Muriwai. They nearly all have the same form of the aeroplane in the sky, which doubles as a flying cross. And although some of them, like this one, have the more conventional form of the cross, the upright form of the cross. This one, the writing reads, Jet Out to Te Reinga. And many of you will realise, of course, that what he's alluding to in these drawings is a Maui myth. The myth that after death, the spirit of the dead person passes up the beaches of the west coast, past Muriwai, past Ahipara, to Te Reinga, from which point it leaps off and makes the return journey to Hawaii. That myth became very important to McCahon. He built many paintings and series around that notion, and of course he identified with it closely because he was living at Muriwai and walking that beach constantly, daily almost. He would walk the beach through all kinds of weathers, in all seasons. And he quite deeply identified with this notion of the spirit passing up those beaches to the leaping off point at Te Reinga. And he came to identify this myth particularly with Baxter. And in fact, so that's what lies behind those drawings. The jet out is a jet plane in the sky. It's also a flying cross. He was well aware, of course, that James K. Baxter was a convert to Catholicism and a deeply devout Catholic. Colin himself never became a Catholic, although there's such a lot of Catholic imagery in his paintings, as I'll talk about a bit in a moment. But this is one of the things they had in common, their deep interest in religion, particularly Catholicism. So in those Easter drawings, he was obviously reflecting on the death of his friend, still trying to expiate that guilt and grief that he felt at having been unreconciled to his old friend at the point of his death. And there's one rather revealing little drawing. I don't know how much of it you can see. Some of these are very, very simple, probably took a few minutes to put on paper. And this one has Oia Island, the little island out off Maui Bay, the sea, the cross and the aeroplane in the sky, and the writing on the bottom says, "Later might I too walk the beach." So he never mentions Baxter by name, but that's what he's thinking about. And he's imagining Baxter walking the beach or travelling the beaches and envisaging his own death and his own spirit, presumably, passing along the beaches in the same fashion. So that was the first major artistic response of McCahon's to Baxter's death, this large series of charcoal drawings. But then, as the year 1973 went on, he got involved in a major series, which is sometimes called the Beach Walk series, although that was not a term that McCahon himself ever used, but one needs to call them something, because what he called them was A, B, C, and D, which is not particularly eloquent, is it? But what happened was that he purchased a very large roll of jute canvas. The height of these individual paintings indicates how wide the roll was, but it was so large that he couldn't handle it in his house, and they had to unroll it in the street outside in Crummer Road. No, they wouldn't have been at Crummer Road, it would have been Partridge Street in Grey Lynn. And he chopped it up into various lengths, and he used it. It took him 2 or 3 years to work his way through this roll of jute. And the way that you can identify the paintings that came from that roll is that there's always a strip along the bottom and a strip along the top which had no paint on them. And then he puts his initials, the date, and a number. In this case it's D1, D2, D3, D4, and D5. And each time he started a new series, he used a different number. So he did 4 series, which he called A, B, C, and D. And then he still went on to use the roll for later series, and the ones he called E were the jump paintings. You probably, if you know McCahon's work, you'll know about the jump paintings. And then I think F were the comets, and then I think he ran out of canvas after that. But so this painting is series D of a series of 4, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the other 3 series just to provide a context. In those days, in the early 70s, Colin had 2 dealers. He showed his work at Barry Lett Galleries in Victoria Street, which subsequently became RKS Art. But in those days it was the Barry Lett Galleries. And he also had Peter McCleavey as his dealer in Wellington. And for a few years he divided his work between those 2 dealers. And this particular set of 4 series, 2 of them were shown at Barry Lett's gallery in, I think, August 1973, A and B. And then in September, the following month, and that exhibition was called Jet Out from Uruguay. It took its name from the charcoal drawings which accompanied the 2 series, A and B. And then the following month in Wellington at the McCleavey Gallery, he showed C and D, also with a bunch of Jet Out from Uruguay drawings. Now, each of the 4 series, they all have a lot in common. They're all, at one level, seaside landscapes of sky and sea and sand. All 4 series have that subject matter, and you can guess that behind them lies that mythology of the beach walk and accompanying his dead friend as he moves up the coastline to the jumping off point. They all have in common the use of the same canvas, but apart from that, they're quite different from each other. And I'll just explain what they were. Series A consisted of 14 separate paintings. This is number 1. Same size, exactly the same size as these ones. So that's number 1, very similar to these ones. I don't know how much of this you can see. But this is number 2, and it's got a little headland you can see at the left, rather like the headland, but not so prominent as in. And this vertical here, which being McCahon and given the context, we can read as part of a cross. And I think this is number, I just got a few of these, I think this is number 4, A4, which also has a headland in it. Most of them don't have headlands, but 2 of that set do. Anyway, they work through this very subdued colouring, grey and white and black and so forth. They are winter paintings. They were painted in June and July and into August. And, you know, they reflect Colin's daily walks along the beach at Uruguay, often fogged in. You know, part of the subdued coloration is the kind of wintry, misty aspect of the beach environment, but also they're wintry in their feeling. You know, they're tragic paintings, if you like. They're grieving paintings. They're paintings about death and loss. But after 13 of these black and grey paintings, number 14 in Series A is this one, which it's quite extraordinary in its impact after the subdued coloration of all of the earlier numbers. Well, Colin couldn't afford to keep that set together, so he sold them separately, and God knows where they are now. They'll probably never be brought together again. I know that 3 of them are in Parliament buildings in Wellington, a set of 3 of them. I know various individual owners who own 1 or perhaps 2. Very occasionally one of them will come up at auction, but they will probably never be brought together as a set again. But why were there 14 of them? Well, there were 14 of them because of the phenomenon of the Stations of the Cross.
Excuse me, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So you know how Colin has numbered these 5 panels in this example?
Yes.
Did he number the panels in this fashion because some of these series were not going to be collectively held together? Did he have some foresight into if they did eventually come back together in the future, they could be put back together via the numbering of each panel?
Yes, that was, and partly he was just, it was just a way of keeping record, you finish one and move on to the next and just number them sequentially. Yeah. As it happens, Series A is the only one that got broken up in that fashion. All of the others pretty much have stayed together. I'll explain about B in a minute. But I need to say something about the Stations of the Cross. In 1966, Colin got a commission to paint windows for a Catholic convent in Remuera Road. No, in Remuera, not Remuera Road, Upland Road, I think it was. And he painted windows, just paint on the glass, not stained glass. Unfortunately, that wasn't a very good idea, and now those paintings are languishing in the basement of the Auckland Art Gallery, too damaged to display. But in addition to the painting the windows, he did a long painting called The Way of the Cross, which is a version of the Stations of the Cross that appears in most Catholic churches. I'm just checking, do I have an image on it? Yes, I do. It's not very easy to see, but this is the Way of the Cross as he painted it on 2 long pieces of hardboard for the wall of the Catholic convent in Upland Road, Remuera. This is now sitting in a lawyer's office in Auckland. I've actually seen it in the flesh. But every Catholic church has a Stations of the Cross, and it's a ritualistic way of recording the narrative of the last days of Jesus, from when he is condemned to death, basically, until he is crucified. And there are 14 stages. Jesus carries the cross. A famous one that Colin loved is Veronica wipes his face. A woman of Jerusalem is, the myth goes that she wiped his face with her handkerchief, and his face was miraculously recorded on her veil. Colin did several versions of Veronica's veil. But in this version, there's a long landscape with hills and valleys, and each station is listed with the little cross at the top. Anyway, he became quite obsessed with that motif of the Stations of the Cross and did many, many versions of it for the next at least 15 years. But he never again did one as close as this to actually writing out the different stations. He did one set, for example, was 14 separate paintings, little landscapes of Otago, which were numbered according to the Stations of the Cross, and many other variants. Sometimes he would just limit the number of works in the series to 14, and there would be no other allusion to the Stations of the Cross except for that number. Well, Series A is an example of that. There were 14. That alludes to the Stations of the Cross, but that's the only allusion. There are no crosses, there are no words, there are no numbers, just 14 as a number. But that notion of the Stations of the Cross, I think, lies behind all of these 4 series. that were painted in memory of James K. Baxter. In Series B there are 2 paintings only, and Colin said, 2 huge paintings of the edge of the world, he said. And here's one of them. They're drastically simple with sky and sea, I suppose you could say. And this one is B2, which is even more rigorous and austere and abstract. These are huge paintings, they're at least 2 meters long. So that was Series B, just 2 paintings. Again, the idea of the beach and the walk and the meditation on death, etc. And then Series C is probably the most famous of the 4 series, and it consists of 12 paintings. This is an image of it hung around a corner. There are 12 separate canvases, but he numbers, they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes there are 2 numbers to a canvas, up to 14. So it is the Stations of the Cross again. And as you can see from this one, it does have some crosses quite present in the imagery. This is the one which is known as, the title of it is Walk, and it's in Te Papa. Te Papa bought it for $3.1 million, which is the highest amount of money ever paid for an artwork in New Zealand. And I've got a couple of other images of it. This is the first 4 paintings, just to give you a sense of how they look, and some of them are wide and some of them are narrow, and all of them are exactly the same height, and they're all numbered 1 to 14. Greg O'Brien sent me a wonderful photograph of some schoolgirls sitting in front of the Series C at Te Papa, where it's all hung in a row there rather than round the corner. Anyway, so that was Series C, A, B, C, and Series D. And Series D consists of 5 panels, and the most unusual thing about it, I suppose, is the way that it is hung, because on this one here, it says D5, panel under D3. He actually painted it on the strip at the bottom. So that's where it has to hang, immediately under D3. You know, Colin, he painted about 2,000 works over his 40-year career, and this was the only time that he ever did that. It's completely unique in his work. And what does it do? Of course, it turns it into a cross. And so I guess it underlines the spiritual theme which is working through these paintings. So they've got various levels. You know, there's a personal level, the memory, grieving, expiating guilt of a friend walking the beach on wintry days. There is the Maori level, the whole idea of the spirit passing after death up the beaches to the Cape, and the Christian level. The walk is also a version of the Stations of the Cross, meditating, I suppose, on the crucifixion and everything that means to Christians. The form of the cross that Colin preferred is what is known as the Tau cross, T-A-U. And the Tau cross is a T-shaped cross. It's not like the Latin cross, which is the most familiar cross, or the Greek cross, which has equal vertical and horizontal, or the St Andrew's cross, the Scottish cross, which is a saltire, a crisscross. It's the T cross, and it was the form that he most liked. And I've just got a few images here of paintings of his. It appears in dozens of his works, but here's one example. For example, from 1959, Let Be, from the Elias series, with the very strong T cross at the bottom. In 1971, he did a large series called Necessary Protection, which often has T crosses as part of the imagery. This is a huge painting, at least 2 meters across, which I think is in the Auckland Art Gallery. I don't think it's ever been hung, at least in my 25 years in Auckland. And here's another one. This is from one of the very last series that he ever painted, called Truth in the King Country. Load-bearing structures, I think he called them, and they're based on bridge forms in the King Country, viaducts and that sort of thing, but also, of course, doubling as a T-cross. So in this version, of course, it's not exactly, it's an asymmetrical version of the T-cross, if you like. Well, I've pretty much finished my story, but just to come back to this painting, he calls it, at the top there, Ahipara. Now, that's the only, apart from walk, that's the only word that appears anywhere on any of the 4 series. And Ahipara, of course, is a place, a settlement at the bottom end, southern end of 90 Mile Beach in Northland. It was a place that Colin was very attached to personally, and he often painted. There are several paintings called Ahipara. And of course, it was one of those West Coast beaches that is on the spirit path. So I think mostly one imagines these 4 series are Murawai paintings, the beach where he lived, but in this case, Ahipara, and that headland is something that's, I think there's a headland, not exactly like that, but an impressive chunk of rock at the southern end of Ahipara, and that's what he's referring to. So the Ahipara connects with the spirit path imagery that links through these paintings. And otherwise, I guess, they're just, I think of them as, you know, like snapshots. The beach as it looked on this particular day. But they're not realist either, are they? Yes, you can see sky, you can see water, you can see sand, but they're also abstract paintings as well as realist paintings, and so often in Colin's late work it does have this layering of meanings. You can read it one way or you can read it another. I don't know how you would read this, but I've always assumed that these marks were probably footprints walking the beach, or perhaps birds on the beach. Also perhaps connected with the idea of this passage of the spirit. And then this very strong black and white, very abstract version of the landscape, which is the structure on which it all sits in number D. A subtle and beautiful painting, and in my personal opinion, one of the great paintings by Colin McCahon. And that's my story. Thank you.